The Republic was always destined to conquer the entire galaxy. Such is the nature of sentient beings. We grow, we develop, we spread out and seek resources in space once those things become limited. And so out of the core, the earliest explorers of the Republic went on generation ships to the colonies, and from there they would go on to establish what would be known as the Inner Rim. The Great Manifest period would follow. It was a period characterized by a colonization boom and a huge amount of capital investment from corporations, which helped the Republic reach the expansion region, and finally, the Mid-Rim. But that growth, it would slow down once it passed the Mid-Rim. In Legends, the Great Manifest period ended in 17,000 BBY, which means that for the next 17,000 years, the Outer Rim territories would see spurts of growth and then decline, but never achieve the same population density and riches that we see in the Inner Rim. And mind you, it wasn't because of a lack of effort. Both the Republic and Empire were expansionary sorts of governments by nature. Sure, they had different ideologies and policies for growth, which failed in equally spectacular ways, but both governments understood the importance of the Outer Rim. Actually, the Sith Empire did the best job at creating growth in the Outer Rim, but that was simply because they had to escape the Jedi and Republic onslaught after their own failed invasion of Coruscant. The destruction of Korriban and the Sith genocide that followed forced the Sith to center their operations and growth in the Outer Rim, but ultimately their own chaotic nature would bring an end to their civilization after more than 4,000 years of on and off fighting with the Jedi. With the Sith out of the picture and the Ruusan Reformation bringing a more civilized era to the galaxy, the Republic also began looking outwards. During the High Republic period, also known as the Golden Age for the Republic and their Jedi Defenders, an initiative was started to further map out the Outer Rim territories, providing safe passage for citizens trying to escape the crowded and overpopulated core worlds. Supreme Chancellor Lina So would start a series of projects known as the Great Works. The Starlight Beacon was one of those constructs, a beautiful beacon for wary travelers in the Outer Rim, and also a place from which Jedi Quick Reaction Task Force could be launched from. But ultimately, the High Republic era would end, the Starlight Beacon would fall, and the progress made by the High Republic would be wiped out, and the Outer Rim would return to its former desolate state. Now, decades later, the Senate, in a last-ditch effort, would try to create a free trade zone in the Outer Rim to encourage more growth in that region. This brought capital investment from several galactic companies, but instead of benefiting the Outer Rim, these corporations would carve out their own personal fiefdoms, largely because the Republic government lacked a presence in those areas. Soon, corporations felt entitled to the newfound wealth and territory that they had carved out for themselves, and the Republic's attempt to bring taxation to the Outer Rim without the threat of enforcement or military backing leads to the secessionist movement and the separatist crisis, and ultimately the Clone Wars. The Republic would fall shortly after. One could argue that their attempt to tame the Outer Rim was a fatal mistake, one that the Empire learned very little from. The Empire would also try to take the Outer Rim. They weren't interested in economic growth or expanding their populace to those regions. Instead, they just wanted the resources. And so the Empire tried to brute force their way using their massive navy. They raided planets for wealth and minerals and left them desolate and even more desperate. And within just a decade of doing this, the first rebel movements began to emerge at the planetary level, and then at the sector level, and then finally at the galactic level. The Rebel Alliance would emerge out of all of this chaos in the Outer Rim, and once again the central government would be toppled by their attempt to tame this region of space. So clearly the Outer Rim has always been the Achilles heel for any central government controlling the galaxy, so how would you actually tame this area of the galaxy? Clearly the over-reliance by the Republic on corporate investment was flawed, as was the Empire's strategy of oppression and pacification through the use of military force. But a middle ground always exists, and it's usually the best way to tackle any situation. And to find the solution to this problem, we must first ask ourselves the question, what makes people pick up their lives and move to a new planet, a new area of the galaxy? Well, the simplest reason is that life in these new areas are perceived to be better and easier than where the people had previously lived. Poverty was rampant in the core and colonies regions of the galaxy. There was a lot of overcrowding and imbalance in the distribution of wealth. Just take a look at Han Solo's upbringing in the sewers of Cornet City, or the Martinez sisters in the lower levels of Coruscant, or the street urchins that lived on Dayu City. Even Cyril Karn's existence as a worker within the Bureau of Statistics, which probably would have made him middle class, seems extremely undesirable. So what prevents these people from seeking what clearly can be a much better and easier existence on one of the Outer Rim territory planets? Well, before we even talk about all the dangers they could face, we need to talk about the lack of infrastructure. The first hurdle is transport. The people who can actually afford to take that long and dangerous journey from the core and colony regions to the Outer Rim have enough wealth where starting a new life on a new planet might not be desirable, unless it's just a venture they're seeking. But such people are rare, and most individuals live practical lives and move out of necessity and to seek a better life. And so this is where the Republic's government policy can step in. For instance, the Republic could create a new bureau for colonization of the Outer Rim. It would have its own fleet of ships, training and education courses to teach urban dwellers how to survive, how to farm for food and moisture, how to extract resources and fabricate shelter. You can also create incentives for private companies and NGOs to also create their own companies that could provide a similar service. This type of competition could be really good, and it could also fit a lot of niche needs that different species might have. Maybe you can have NGOs that are dedicated to aquatic species, or a private company that wants homesteaders to grow certain foods that are in demand in their distribution network. Now, these private entities would need to have some checks and balances on them, some regulations to make sure that they don't exploit the colonists that they're actually being asked to take care of. You also need the threat of enforcement to make sure that these policies are upheld in the Outer Rim territories. And this is why, like most projects that succeed, this idea should be tested out step by step to see what works and what doesn't. Perhaps the Republic could focus on developing just one sector at a time, ideally a sector with a minimum of 50 habitable planets with a wide diversity of biomes and resources available. This makes the project a lot more manageable. It allows the regulators to be more focused in how they do their job, and at the same time it gives these private and NGO organizations the ability to do what they do best. This entire project, of course, would need a security force, a federalized military. And yes, I know the Rusan Reformation bans this, but if you've ever met a senator in real life, especially those who come from a legal background, there are really no laws that they can't find a loophole in and get around if they want to. Let's call this army the Outer Rim Expeditionary Force, and let's limit its area of operation to just the Outer Rim. That might help it get around the Rusan Reformation's regulations. This military force should be created from scratch and not be formed out of co-opted PDF forces to avoid cultural clash and corruption from the outset. And mind you, this needs to be a legitimate military force, not just a heavily armed police force. And that's because you will need a legitimate military force in the Outer Rim. Just ask the Chiss in the unknown region just how many barbaric alien species and pirate lords there are to deal with. If you invest as much credits as I'm suggesting the Republic does into this one sector, it's going to attract entire armies, not just small bands of raiders. And the firepower, the organization, and logistics you'll need to defend an entire sector of space is going to be serious. I'm talking about at least one massive command ship that's the size of a city that can make short work of pirate flagships, and several ships of the line, carriers, frigates, corvettes, to protect the hyperspace lanes and allow free movement for trade and people. Now, here on Earth, a lot of people criticize the United States and their allies' foreign policy and military forces, which are deployed all around the globe. And I think a lot of this criticism is valid. There have definitely been some terrible things done in the name of creating this new order. But at the same time, what it creates is a freedom of navigation in all of the oceans in the world, and a rules-based order, which I think is incredibly important. This has allowed for an unprecedented amount of growth and movement, which has made the last 70 years the most prosperous in human history. And while some areas of the world have definitely suffered during this period of time, either through incompetence or malicious intent by the American-led global order, overall, it's definitely created huge positives for the majority of humanity. That is undeniable, and it's connected many cultures and lifted billions out of abject poverty. What we really don't want to go back to is an era of protectionism and mercantilism, where the import of goods illegally from another nation resulted in death, which severely limited trade and access to goods for many countries, and also made the import of goods illegally from one nation to another extremely, extremely dangerous. And back in those days, every sea lane outside of your own sovereign territory looked like the Somali coastline. The reality is, someone needs to step in with a big stick and keep some kind of order for there to be prosperity and stability. A similar concept applies to the Outer Rim territories. A massive naval presence will also be needed to secure the Outer Rim and promote the growth that's needed there. The only way you're going to attract businesses and settlers is if they have a guarantee that they won't be robbed or kidnapped or shot at. You'll also need a ground force garrisoned on every planet, larger reserve forces in capital areas of the new sector, and yes, this This needs to be separate from the Jedi and judicial peacekeepers. This is a problem that both the Republic and the Empire have made in their own history. They believe that a military and a police force can be the same thing. They really cannot. A military is a weapon and a defensive tool against outside forces. A police force like the Jedi and judicials is designed to preserve the peace and uphold the law and serve the people. These are two very separate and important jobs with different equipment and training, and when one entity is given both jobs, several problems begin to arise. And on top of that, you'll need a very professional military and police force, because there will be those who are tempted to declare martial law and overstep their legal powers because of the dangerous nature of the area. Now, there is one huge glaring issue with my plan, and that is the crazy amount of credits and resources that will be needed to actually kick it off. Initially, this new sector in the Outer Rim will produce very little taxable income. And even then, you probably don't want to levy any taxes at all just to promote growth in those first few decades. And so you're going to have to do something that democracies are relatively poor at, and that is creating a long-term plan that rolls out in decades, if not half a century. That's probably how long it will take for this region to stabilize and generate enough tax revenue so that it can sustain its own security forces. Member states of the wider galaxy will need to be willing to allow their tax revenue to be redirected to such a project. And you'll need a political environment similar to the Great Manifest period, where expansionism becomes an ideology and has a base for support. If anything, this would be easier for Emperor Palpatine to pull off. Instead of spending a large chunk of the Empire's GDP on the Death Star, he could have just deployed one sector fleet into the Outer Rim to protect the economic development there, instead of using it against the people he was exploiting. Once one sector is deployed, that shining light can be spread to a nearby sector that's right beside it, and one sector at a time, you can bring the light of the Republic to every corner of the galaxy. The Republic ultimately had the resources to achieve this type of plan. The galaxy was stupendously rich. Expansion into the Outer Rim, in the long run, would have created a much safer and prosperous galaxy for all. But democracies are only as strong as the voters themselves, and while it's easy to criticize elected officials and blame the system for every problem, ultimately the voters are the ones who elect officials, and they have a huge percentage of the responsibility for which course the government takes. And the Republic, in its heyday, had become a bloated and corrupt system because the voters allowed it to be. 1,000 years of peace and prosperity made people take the system for granted. And so you had individuals like High Republic Chancellor Lina So, who was more flesh than substance. This woman ran around with 2 giant alien cats as if their presence could distract us from her incompetence. The Starlight Beacon was a great gesture, but ultimately a very empty one that did not have the resources necessary to tame the Outer Rim. It was literally just a shiny candle that attracted bandits. On the other hand, you have Chancellor Palpatine, who was just complete chaos. He pretended to be a savior of the Republic. He told the populace he had all of the answers, but all he actually wanted was just power for himself. And he proved to be equally as incompetent as Lina So in implementing policy, but in a much more destructive way that will create much longer-lasting damage to the galaxy. The sad truth is the ability to campaign and market oneself is not directly tied to success in a leadership position. And so we as voters have to be aware of these types of politicians who try to rile up our emotions instead of challenge our minds with interesting policy. We need to be aware of the populace who talks in anecdotes instead of policies, or else we'll never be able to tackle the Outer Rim-like challenges in our own galaxy.